So I'm assuming a little bit of knowledge on Emily Dickinson, but I'll probably sort of improvise a little bit. So there's a written core to this. This is I think the fifth essay I've written on Dickinson in like 5 months or something like that. So I want to have some new material each time. And so I'm really working on a golden age of Dickinson scholarship, particularly some women that I'm going to mention have done great work. And I do have a copy of the master letters with me, which I forgot. So we must get to that. There are 2 editions, the Franklin and the new one, the Marta Werner one. The best access to the master letters is actually on YouTube at Susan Howe's reading, particularly of the Master Letter 3, which is an extraordinary document. But anyway, I shall start at the end, which is with some details of Emily Dickinson's funeral, as she instructed. Her sister Vinnie asked her sister-in-law, Susan Gilbert Dickinson, to bathe and clothe the body. The sacred task given to Emily's former lover saw her radiant in a fresh white dress in an open coffin. A pink lady slipper orchid was placed above her heart with a bunch of violets and a vanilla-scented heliotrope to take to Judge Otis Lord, her other lover. Ground pine surrounded her body. Wentworth Dickinson read Emily Bronte's No Coward Soul is Mine at the homestead parlour. The white coffin was carried by the Amherst College president and lawyer friends of her brother, Austin, out of the back of the house to the barn, where it was picked up by 6 Dickinson Irish labourers. This is extraordinary and was hugely shocking, not just to the village, but to the family. But they carried on because it was her instructions. Sadly, the document is lost, so this is cobbled together from a range of primary sources. The chief pallbearer was the maid, Maggie Mayer's brother-in-law, Tom Kelly, who had comforted her on the death of Otis Lord. They took Emily for a tour of her flower garden on a sunny 19th of May, 1886, across the Buttercup Meadow, full of wild flowers, to West Cemetery. Her simple gravestone read, in those days, E.E.D. In other words, she refused the limelight of the family mansion by going at the back, and pointedly associated herself with Irish immigrants who, like her ancestors, were hoping to build a better life. Susan lined the grave with evergreen boughs, but did not attend the interment due to her husband's affair with Mabel Loomis Todd. There's now a huge footnote on the way the archive is split in 2 because of the rivalry between the 2 ladies and their ancestors, which goes right through to 1961, when Harvard control all the documents and ban anybody apart from one man to go into the archive, which explains why the master letters are kind of an unknown document until much later in history. Getting back to the funeral, the details are significant. So flowers are everywhere in this mix of paganism and self-effacement. Maggie was the only person who knew the extent of Emily's writing, as it was often written in her presence in the kitchen and kept in her trunk. It's Maggie who provides the only certain image we have of Emily, and disobeys Emily by not burning the poems as she instructed. But she knew she wouldn't do this. It was the only safe way she could secure those poems being passed on. They baked together, washed together, and discussed the Irish situation. Now, the kitchen doors were always open to Dickinson workers who were Afro-American, Native American, Irish, and English settlers. Emily listened to their stories and speech patterns, which echo in her poems in different ways. Emily would have known that Wuthering Heights as Heathcliff, found by the Liverpool docks and speaking gibberish to Nellie Dean's ear, was Irish. Emily's Bronte poem draws attention to their correspondences and echoes their fearlessness in approaching a deeper knowledge of ever-present deity in the natural world and the magic of the world of things. As the poem ends, there is not room for death, nor atom that his might could render void, since thou art being and breath, and what thou art may never be destroyed. That sense of the eternal has a Neoplatonist echo that we know from William Blake, and that is significant when placing her thought beyond Unitarianism and Transcendentalism. Now, Susan's Springfield Republican obituary the day before mentions Emily's exceptional intellect, her gifts for the sick and dying of all classes in the village, her rare flowers embodying a heavenly paradise, her grace, her talk, and writings like no other, and then states, like a magician, she caught the shadowy apparitions of her brain and tossed them in startling picturesques to her friends, who, charmed with their simplicity and homeliness as well as profundity, fretted that she had so easily made palpable the tantalizing fancies forever eluding their bungling, fettered grasp. So intimate and passionate was her love of nature, she seemed herself to be a part of the high March sky, the summer day and bird call. This passage gives great insight to both Emily's character and to her mode of poetic communication. To Susan, Emily was both saintly and a magician, imbued in place with no creed or formulated faith. Now, Emily was part of a preeminent family in that area of lawyers, heavily involved in education and politics. They'd settled into that farming community around Amherst. Originally from Lincolnshire, they were dissenters seeking paradise on earth. They built Amherst College and believed in educating women. The townsfolk knew the Bible and talked about it as we might discuss a film or drama series, as well as their Shakespeare and the natural world. So Emily's education included botany, geology, chemistry. She read some books she wrote passionately about a history of sulfuric acid at the age of 15. And she was introduced to Darwinism, pre-Darwinism as it were, but eventually it becomes Darwinism at an early age. There are exhibitions at the college, and like Darwin, she experimented with both plants and writing. So her intellectual development involved a grasp of natural magic, history, a close reading of Noah Webster's Dictionary of the American Language, of which there are 3 copies in the homestead, and contemporary literature with books, particularly on Emily Bronte, arriving daily from London and Boston. And it's, as Susan Howe and my Emily Dickinson has shown, she was a dissenter, imbued in family history, what she called her circumference, who loved to question from all angles. Her famous poem sent to Samuel Bowles, a transcendentalist, in early 1861, when civil war was inevitable, reads, "Faith is a fine invention for gentlemen who see, but microscopes are prudent in an emergency." written for the future, we can read this poem as relevant to our climate change emergency. She is, after all, the poet of flower, birds and butterflies. Emily is hugely relevant to our numerous emergencies. Microscopes here is not simply science, but an exhortation to perceive and think deeply. Faith here has a transcendentalist meaning for bulbs. A variant copy was sent to Dickinson, a Unitarian, in 1862. Here's the nub of the matter. Emily was a contrarian dissenter, and dissent for her involved prodding, probing, and being argumentative. Her father, Edward, could argue eloquently for and against slavery. Emily embodied that deep questioning spirit of dissent that moved beyond binaries. Her tonal shifts in a poem illustrate her angular approach to things. Many people simply did not understand her talk, and when Dickinson met her for the first time, he was left a nervous wreck by the extreme nature of her aphorisms and use of riddles. Now, Dickinson had met Darwin in Deal, had led a regiment of black soldiers in the Civil War, and he could not cope with her mental agility. She was like that, and people just said, "What? To what?" You know, they just didn't understand her. Emily's letters to Dickinson are amongst the finest in the canon. They're arguably letters and poems. Her teenage letters evince phenomenal rhetorical skill in ending an argument in favour against dogmatic thinking. She outwitted everyone. She preserved 3 unsent letters addressed to a master that have sent scholars looking for an addressee. The master letters, written after midnight, are extraordinary documents. They employ disjuncture, juxtaposition, radical compression, botany, geology, unusual self-referential detail, as if addressed to some distant, beyond the seas, master figure. They move at speed from point to point, a bit like Tom Rayworth, maybe. Susan Howe was the first critic that drew upon their literary sources, notably David Copperfield, Wuthering Heights. And they were useful in developing her writing skills. And it's Howe's graduate student Martha Werner, this lady here, who subsequently spent 20 years in the Houghton Library and, fortunately, the Amherst College archives as well, adding to Howe's brilliant detective work on the fascicles and the master manuscripts, as they're now been retitled. And her book, Writing in Time, is an exemplary textual study of the manuscripts, arguing for the addition of other poems to be added to the master writings. So the master letters are not letters at all. It's because people hadn't been allowed to look at them to find out that they weren't letters. They're actual long, thin poems, as written as conversational letters. So Emily preserved them for immortality. They must have had value for her and the future. She kept them for 30-odd years, so there's got to be a reason she did it. Once Emily decided that she was writing to friends and above all the future in manuscripts and letters, then they became essential experiments for the development of her writing. So it's her way of becoming a better writer. They stand as preserved documents to illustrate to future readers how she developed her skills to impart those cognitive shifts of register which make her poetry so strange and memorable. As Howe wrote, Emily reveals and conceals simultaneously as a literary performance. We now know, thanks to the Dickinson Museum at the Homestead, that Emily had access to the attic where she read her poems and Shakespeare aloud as part of originally the Shakespeare Reading Club, but then subsequently on her own, most likely. There could have been an audience, we don't know. What is extraordinary is that after writing 300 poems a year during the Civil War years, she decided to write on envelopes and scraps of paper. She even wrote on the same page as a Maggie Mayer manuscript, one of her poems. In 1961, when Harvard University had control of the two largest archival collections, they stopped academics from reading the manuscripts and the family library. So it's not until Susan Howe, Martha Nell Smith and others are allowed to look at the manuscripts again at Amherst College that these neglected documents come under more accurate textual study and are given archival numbers. You can actually go online and see all the archives. Now they've been digitalised. Now this is where Susan Howe's importance, this kind of rescuing Emily, comes in. She was the first to identify Emily's handwriting and punctuation in her fascicles are performative, combining a visual force with exact physical line breaks linked to metrics. This happens from 1860 onwards. It's a distinct break which is visible. Now she wrote to the Harvard-appointed editor Ralph Franklin and received a dismissive and curt response. Franklin produced the first manuscript edition of the poems and the master letters, as letters, not poems, and gave then his system of line breaks, completely misrepresenting her use of space and fragmentation. Howe's subsequent essay in The Birthmark starts the movement away from intrusive editors and reiterates the importance of variations, the shapes and marks on the manuscripts, in other words, going back to the original documents. First thing to say, this is not print poetry. This is intentional visual and sound poetry. In other words, they're both drama and music in the handwriting and spaces between the words. I was going to say there was a prom this year on this, by the way, for those of you, Jane told me about it. Emily's envelope poems, written in the kitchen from 1869 onwards on scraps of paper and fixed together with pins, caught my eye thanks to Martha Werner's Gorgeous Nothings book. I first came across it on a YouTube. It was the Houghton Library at Harvard launch of the book. Well worth watching. They're an extension of her writing practice as an artist in the kitchen. So they break down any linear reading of stanzas and fragments, allowing each to be read in any order as the reader turns the envelope or scrap of paper around. It's quite an extraordinary experience. Each way you turn it, you'll get a different beginning and a different ending. Quite an extraordinary thing. So it's just a remarkable poetry for the future, and I thought, why not talk about it? So thank you for listening.